So I think because there are so few of us, I'll just invite us all to kind of gather in and gather around in whatever way is comfortable. But also, rather than talk, maybe I'll propose this as a conversation we can have together of different principles that we can incorporate for any organizer to be able to integrate into their work. And so I created this little sheet just to talk about going from a theoretical, what is bioregionalism, into a how do we shift that into action and see it in our kind of engagement with what we do. And through that, I put together just a simple bullet point list, and then a few different kind of key thoughts trying to summarize what we have in terms of what are the different components that make up a bioregional movement. Firstly, bioregional movements start with each of us and are place-based. So we start with our watersheds and work our way up. Bioregional movements seek to move us away from boundaries, borders, and systems which aren't necessarily representative of our ecosystems or those of us living here. And so it will always work to decentralize and move away from those types of systems and much more focus on a local system and the people living. Bioregional movements are open source and non-proprietary. They build on mutual collaboration. So whether we're one organization, one person, a bioregional movement, or collective of groups, we will always collaborate with those where we have shared principles, shared values, and work together to strengthen all of our collective messages and impacts. I guess with that, we work to empower a movement of leaders where every person can have the tools that they need to make the impact that they want to see. And it'd be wonderful if we can do that in a way in which we're supported and able to do that. A bioregional movement provides a positive vision for which we can work towards rather than just what we're against. And I think especially in this time, it's really important that while we don't have maybe necessarily any control over a federal structure which might not represent us, we have complete control over our local ecosystems and actions. We can walk out our door right now and start to take action. And as we grow our own systems, we will be moving away from systems which may be negative or toxic and be empowering those around us where that change is happening. I think bioregional movements support the diversity and wide variety of voices and experiences within the bioregion, with an emphasis on supporting marginalized groups. So just like an ecosystem needs diversity to thrive, bioregional movements are really built on everybody who lives here and all voices kind of working with our shared experience and creating space where also those voices can really find a platform to amplify those words and effects. I think one thing that's important is that while we talk about Cascadia as a social and cultural movement, it does incorporate politics. And I would say that those politics really focus on a local level where it can be empowering. And I tend to say that it moves us away from a federal system which can be very disenfranchising and unempowered. So by affecting culture, it's everything. It's food, music, language. It's everything of how we interact and talk with one another. And together that creates kind of the larger context of where we live. I think one part of that is that also the idea that culture stems from place. And so that means that by living here together in this region, we're going to have shared experiences and shared fears and shared values with our neighbors because of similar things. And so I would talk about the question earlier about, well, what do people in Eastern Washington have to do with Western Washington and kind of Cascadia's definition of water? And to that I would say, we all share the watershed of the Columbia River. And so if we're going to talk about damming or salmon restoration, or if we're going to talk about wildfires, that will be an issue that we are all sharing and kind of have together and that affect us that maybe you don't if you're living in New York. You don't know what wildfires are. Or if we're preparing for earthquakes. That's something that we all have to share, whether or not there's an international border there or not. And so within that, we support groups that align with our bioregional principles and work to build them into a bioregional movement that we are all a part of. State boundaries don't necessarily define this. We work together with people in Portland, people in Olympia, people in Eugene, people in Boise, people in Moscow, and we work together because we have shared principles and values, and we're all trying to create a better world for each of us, and we're all going to do that in slightly different ways, and we're all have different things that were important to each of us. And we can work together through these place-based hubs to really maximize that effort and impact, and within that, move us away from the idea of existing state or county, lines. I think when I go to a meeting and it can be a Washington state gathering of labor leaders and political leaders and nonprofit organizations, and it hurts so bad when they're talking about creating a united front of resistance, and then they stop at the edge of Washington. And it's like, if we want to make a real impact or a real movement that can be long-lasting, that has to include Portland, and it has to include Vancouver, BC, and it has to include the voices that are east of the Cascades. And without that, we'll continue to be isolated and secularized by kind of identity politics or specific issues. So I think one of my favorite things also is people talk a lot about economics, and I think bioregions are kind of a really neat context because they fit into both a context which is very hyper-local and local, and starting with our watersheds, but it's also global. And so locally we really focus to build an interdependence between all of us and all of our ecosystems, and it is also global because it acknowledges that we are going to have an effect and need things from outside of our bioregion. And it says that when we do, we want to fit into a global model that is ethical, responsible, sustainable, and non-exploitative. And so within that, we want to be working with and building bioregional movements from around the world so that we can work with them and share knowledge and information, and so that we can be working locally to create models that we can share freely, and then we can be learning from those models that already exist and finding what works best for us here. Bioregions, like ecosystems, thrive and celebrate diversity of people, animals, plants, and cultures. The more diverse a bioregion is, and the more diverse that we can make our own movements, the stronger and more resilient that we can be. And lastly, this is just kind of a personal thing that I throw in, but I think it's really important to create a paradigm shift where we can see people supported doing the work that needs to be done. And that's in the world, and that's for our local societies and all the rest of it. But right now we have a system where we expect people to go work, sometimes doing horrible things, and then we ask them to volunteer their time doing what needs to be done. And so instead of that, I think we can all be working together to see people supported, doing the work that needs to be done, and not any of that. So with this, this is kind of a simple one-page document, but I think something that a lot of Cascadia organizers and other organizers are really looking for is to really start to identify what are the principles that we work around, but then what are ways that we can be helping spread this to build a bioregional movement that's not just Cascadia organizations, but really that we can be a bridge with communities all throughout our watersheds and start to build our framework so that we can work together to maximize all of our own impacts. So, thank you. Yeah. Any questions?
I have a question. You briefly touched on working with other bioregions. I was wondering if you can go over bioregional congresses and what's happening with those and pushes to be involved, for Cascadia to be involved in them, because they're still going, right?
They are, but they're very different than, so they tend to be very expensive and geared towards a specific audience now. And so for those not familiar, so Cascadia and the bioregional movement really grew out of, so bioregionalism as a concept and ideology grew out of Peter Berg and the Planet Drum Foundation in the 1970s. A lot of that was in Northern California before spreading northward, and also Gary Snyder and all the rest. And then it spread northward into the Northwest and was picked up by bioregionalists like David McCloskey and a whole lot of other people who then incorporated and kind of built a Cascadia bioregionalism movement. As part of this, they held a series of national bioregional congresses, which I think were prominent really through the 90s. And so for more than 20 years, they were very active. They do still exist, but are much diminished from what they really once were. And I think it's more like they're kind of a for-profit thing, and it's a little bit weird.
Oh, huh.
But not to say that they don't still happen and all the rest. But because of that, there were these really cool documents that came out on these bioregional congresses. And the whole idea is that you would go to a bioregional congress representing your watershed, and you met delegatively. And the difference between, say, like an educational conference or a issue where you're a representative was rather that you actually went as a delegate. And then they would form different committees on environment or culture, or they could break it into issues. So, like economy or, dams. And then they would talk about what they would actually want to do that in the upcoming year, and then they would go out and do it. And the national bioregional congresses were interspersed with bioregional congresses, where Cascadia would meet. And the first Cascadian Bioregional Congress was held on Evergreen campus in 1986. And that gathered more than 100 people, and then subsequently they would meet, and through the 90s they kind of got bigger and bigger until they incorporated hundreds of people. And what's fun is sometimes they would talk about issues, and they would identify things like recycling programs, community gardens, are all ideas that really kind of grew out of these early movements. But sometimes also it would be that we have a policy that needs to be passed, and so there'd be initiatives, or sometimes people would run for county commissioner seats, and they would work together to identify what those issues are, identify strategies, and be representative of a multitude of watersheds, groups, collectives, and all the rest of that. And we're lucky enough to have some of those original documents, which we're working. We've got the first two transcripts kind of like scanned in and documented, but we're working with some of those early bioregional organizers to also try and gather a lot more resources together to make freely available. And they were tackling a lot of issues very early that you still hear today. So. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Your last one about, rather than needing to do things they don't want to do, from them being asked to volunteer their time. That just resonates so deeply with me, because I really noticed that that it's a really big thing in the younger people today. I'm 54, so I don't want to speak for younger people, but I have, young children, and 22 and 26 and 38, and I just, in my younger, my 22, my 26, and their friends, and just knowing a lot of younger people, I've noticed that to be more and more of a theme, or not a theme, but just this almost like an angst, this feeling of being so unsatisfied with the system, and I think that's really a lot to do with all kinds of problems, in our culture. Of some people will say, like, especially in my generation, will say, in a really negative way, like these kids, they're like, what's wrong with them, and they're still living with their parents, or they're just unsettled and depressed, and they're getting into drugs and all this crap because they're so unsatisfied with the system, and so I'm really grateful for my ability to be, which is not easy, to be able to have allowed my younger kids especially to kind of fumble around a little bit and take their time and not worry about it, and be more like, well, what's gonna make you happy, what gives you joy, and anyway, so I just really appreciate you putting that in there. I think it's so important that we figure that out.
Really important.
Really important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things. I know that it's very important with a lot of Cascadia organizations in general to both credit, but then also like compensate, and then that's something that we've made very important with CascadiaNow and now other organizations, is to really work to try and see people supported, and doing the work that we want to do, and paying a fair wage and paying a living wage, and so that we can all kind of better grasp that. But yeah, the goal is it really should be about what makes us happy, and then what can we be doing to better the earth and better our livelihoods of everybody living here, including our ecosystem, our planet, our ocean, our forests and mountains, and then also the people. So it's very important. So thank you.
So this sheet talks a lot about diversity, and mentions supporting marginalized groups. How are you doing, or are you working on bringing people who aren't white guys into leadership in this movement?
Sure. So the first thing is that it's an open movement, so that anybody who does want to stand up can. But more than that, we're actively working to really, so my own personal work now has really shifted from CascadiaNow much more to the Cascadia Underground, which is a media center which hosts programs such as, so like Join the Cause, Cascadians Against White Supremacy, I think would be one of the biggest examples of this, where rather than just creating like kind of an arbitrary way or a method that like is saying that we want diversity, we're actively working to solicit and actually go out, reach out, and talk with communities. And so what I would say about that is that we create a platform where marginalized voices can share if they'd like to, but we also create resources and educational materials where we can be creating our own knowledge base and educating ourselves in ways that we can be more effective allies and kind of grow our solidarity. And then we create space anytime that marginalized communities or kind of members would like to step up and take leadership positions. And so by doing that, I think what's really incredible is the Cascadia movement, while maybe not reflected in this room right now, I think is actually one of the most diverse movements that I've really seen. And you become aware of it when you put up a table, or whether you start wearing the patch and get to start talking with people. But to see the type of people who come up to the table that are excited, it's one of the most multi-generational, multi-backgrounds, I think movements that I've really seen. And to also be able to excite the imagination of people to kind of like be working towards something better. So it's not that clear of an answer, but yeah.
I'm just saying, no offense, but if the presenters here are a representation of the leadership of the Seattle chapter, it's not very diverse.
Okay. So would Aaron or
Yeah, I mean, it's not. But a lot of the things that we actively support, the main thing is direct action of Indigenous-led campaigns. And that's kind of our main involvement in what we do as a chapter, specifically with the Puyallup tribe and their work towards the no LNG liquid natural gas terminal. And then also with Mazasca Talks and their divestment campaign. And then I'm not sure which tribes were involved with the Olympia action. I think it was a coalition of different tribes. So that's kind of like our main, we want to put our energy towards those actions. And, our leadership is white because it is, we're the ones able with the time to step up right now. Really, like, there's, marginalized communities have a lot to deal with at the moment, and they're fighting in their way, and we are coming here to support their fight.
I will say things like the Cascadia Underground, so we're starting with 7 programs, and the project leaders, a majority of the project leaders there are people of color, or also like, just because someone's white doesn't mean they're not a minority or a marginalized community in another way too. So.
What's the 7 programs?
To starting with so far, actually, so Seattle CascadiaNow is doing a podcast, but we also have Sanctuary City Music Project. So they're working with musicians, politicians, and artists that are kind of really like involved with, that are outspoken in their own work. And they come in and do interviews and then do original compilation recordings, and then we sell those to raise money for different nonprofits, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, other things. Join the Cause, Cascadians Against White Supremacy. And they're kind of focusing on bringing people in for, so using that specifically actually as a platform to reach out to diverse communities and marginalized communities as an opportunity to do interviews and then kind of like TEDx style talks that can also be inspirational with people that are actively incorporating either anti-racism or anti-white supremacy into different aspects of their organizing, business, or whatever they're doing. Another one is Lucid Vibe Radio. That is a, I don't know, online radio station that really focuses to have a conscious and ethical presence. There is, what are the others? So another one is, Upzone's podcast will be our first one recording podcast. Ian Martinez, who runs Rain City Slam, but also this will be disconnected and much more a focus of where he's interviewing civic leaders here in Seattle on issues of gentrification. And then Pepper Spray Media, which is which stemmed out of the indie media movement, where the first chapter was actually founded here in 1999 in Seattle during the WTO protests. Pepper Spray was their video wing, and after indie media collapsed, this is kind of a continuation. And right now they're documenting a range of different things here and working on like a Black Panthers documentary, and have several other unfinished projects that they're working to finish. Yeah, and part of it is also just creating services and media teams that can help document news, both here locally, but then also forming chapters and really restarting the tradition of independent media and citizen-run journalism. So that'll be very exciting. We're actually very excited.
Yeah.